The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warm glow of birthday candles. Margaret stood at the head of the long oak table, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly as she lifted her wine glass. It was her 68th birthday, the one day she still believed her family would gather around her with love. Her son David sat directly across, his face unreadable under the golden chandelier. His wife Anna smiled politely, though her eyes carried a sharpness Margaret had never liked. "Mom, say something," Anna urged with a saccharine grin. "You've raised a wonderful family. You should make a toast." Margaret chuckled nervously. "A toast?" she repeated, her voice cracking slightly. "Well, I guess I just want to say how grateful I am." She didn't finish, because David suddenly stood up. The chair screeched backward, his fists clenched at his sides. His eyes were filled with something Margaret hadn't seen in decades: fury. "Stop pretending!" he shouted, his voice slicing through the laughter like glass shattering. "You're not my real mother!" The room froze. Every fork, every breath hung midair. The candles flickered, throwing trembling shadows on Margaret's stunned face. What did you just say?" she whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. David threw a folder onto the table. It slid across the wood and landed in front of her birthday cake. A thin layer of powdered sugar from the cake sprinkled over the envelope like snow. "I found this," he said coldly, "a hospital record, a birth certificate, and it says my mother's name isn't Margaret Lewis." Gasps filled the room. Anna looked away, biting her lip. Margaret's heart began to race. The room spun, her knees weakening as the edges of her vision blurred. "I don't know what you think you found," she murmured. "But David, I was there when you—" David cut her off, voice cracking. "You lied to me all my life." Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the file. The envelope was old, yellowed, creased, stamped with the hospital's faded seal. She looked at it as if it were a ghost from another lifetime. The candles on the cake flickered out one by one, smoke curling into the tense silence. Margaret lifted her eyes, wet and fierce. "If you think I'm not your mother," she said quietly, her voice trembling with both sorrow and strength, "then maybe it's time you learn what really happened the night you were born." The room fell silent again. Only the sound of the clock ticking filled the air, counting down to the moment when 40 years of buried truth would finally come to light. The words hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. David stared at his mother, disbelief tightening every muscle in his face. Anna's hand slipped into his under the table, a silent act of support or control. Margaret could no longer tell. She turned slowly, walked to the corner cabinet, and opened a drawer that had remained locked for decades. Her hands shook as she pulled out an old metal box, the kind that once held recipes and photos, now covered in dust and silence. The family watched as she set it on the table with a dull thud. David frowned. "What is this supposed to be, another lie?" Margaret didn't answer. She unlocked the box, the rusty latch creaking open. Inside were baby photos, a small blue hospital bracelet, and a folded piece of paper so brittle it looked ready to crumble. She placed the bracelet on the table. The tiny tag read, "Baby Boy Lewis, room 304. Then she lifted her eyes, meeting David's. "That's the night you were born," she said softly. "The night everything went wrong." The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Even the air seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. "It was the summer of 1984, she began. "The hospital lost power during a storm. The maternity ward was chaos. Babies crying, alarms blaring, nurses running with flashlights. I remember holding you for the first time, but—" Her voice cracked.
But when I woke up after surgery, the bracelet on your wrist, it wasn't the same one I'd seen before."
David's jaw tightened. "Are you saying someone switched me?" Margaret's eyes flickered, as if afraid to look at him too long. "I didn't know, David. I told myself it was just a mix-up. I was young, terrified, alone, and your father was out of town. But I couldn't let them take you away from me. You were my son the moment I heard you cry." David's face softened for a second, then hardened again. "So you suspected something all along, and you said nothing." The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the ticking clock sounded accusatory. Margaret's throat tightened, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid of losing you. I thought the truth would destroy us both." David took a step back, shaking his head. "Maybe it already has." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door so hard that one of the candles toppled over, spilling wax down the side of the untouched cake. Margaret stood there, frozen, the blue hospital bracelet still glinting under the flickering light. She whispered to no one in particular, "You were never supposed to know this way." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, echoing the night he was born. The storm that night had never left her memory. Even 40 years later, Margaret could still hear the thunder that shook the windows of St. Mary's Hospital, could still feel the cold metal of the delivery bed beneath her palms. The fluorescent lights had flickered once, twice, then gone out entirely. In the sudden darkness, panic filled the ward. She had gone into labor early, 6 weeks before her due date. The nurses rushed in and out, their flashlights slicing through the blackness like restless ghosts. "We're doing everything we can," one of them said, her voice trembling more than the floor beneath them. Margaret was 28, terrified, and alone. Her husband, Peter, was away on business. No cell phones, no one to call, only the sound of rain hammering against the roof and the rising cries of newborns echoing down the corridor. When she finally heard his cry, sharp, loud, defiant, it was like the world stopped spinning. A nurse placed a small, warm bundle in her arms. "Baby boy Louis," she said, smiling under her mask. "He's strong." Margaret stared at the tiny bracelet around his wrist, engraved with that name. She kissed his forehead, tears of exhaustion and love mixing with the storm outside. But just minutes later, she felt dizzy. Her body went cold. The nurse's face blurred as she whispered something Margaret couldn't quite catch. Then everything went black. When she woke up, it was morning. The sunlight was pale, and the room smelled of antiseptic and wet clothes drying on the radiator. Her baby lay in the bassinet beside her, swaddled in blue. But something was different. The bracelet. The tag now read, "Baby boy number 302, temporary ID." Not Louis, not her son's name, just a number. Her pulse quickened. "Nurse?" she called out weakly. A different woman entered, older, cold eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes?" "The bracelet," Margaret said, pointing. "It was different before. It said, 'Baby boy Louis.'" The nurse frowned. "You must be mistaken, Mrs. Lewis. We had a blackout last night. The tags were reissued to avoid confusion. Everything's fine." But everything didn't feel fine. Margaret reached out, touching her baby's cheek. He was warm, breathing softly, but she felt a strange distance, a question forming deep inside her chest. Later that evening, while walking to the nursery window, she noticed another mother standing nearby, elegant, well-dressed, even in a hospital gown. Her hair perfect, her jewelry untouched by the chaos. The woman turned, their eyes met. "First child?" the woman asked, smiling faintly. "Yes," Margaret replied. "Mine too," she said, "though I almost lost him last night." Margaret nodded, unsure why her stomach tightened at those words. 2 babies, born the same night, one moment of darkness, and a lifetime of doubt beginning to bloom. In the days that followed, the storm outside finally quieted, but inside the maternity ward, Margaret's world stayed unsettled. She kept staring at the bracelet around the baby's wrist, that bland, impersonal tag with a number instead of his name. Each time she asked about it, the nurses brushed her off with soft smiles and practiced calm. "Administrative mix-up, dear, happens all the time." She wanted to believe them. She wanted to believe that nothing was wrong, that the baby sleeping in her arms really was hers. Yet every time she looked into his eyes, she felt something shift, an ache of love wrapped in an edge of fear. On the third day, the elegant woman she had met by the nursery window, Eleanor, came to visit again. She glided into the room in a silk robe that didn't belong in a hospital. Her perfume lingered, faint but expensive, and Margaret suddenly felt small in her faded nightgown. "You're Margaret Lewis, aren't you?" Eleanor asked softly, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I heard we delivered around the same time." "Yes," Margaret said. "It was a rough night." Eleanor smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough for some more than others. I almost lost my baby when the lights went out. The doctor said they had to resuscitate him." Margaret's heart clenched. "Is he okay?" "Oh, yes," Eleanor replied, her tone almost casual. "He's strong. They brought him back to me early this morning. He looks different somehow, but I suppose that's normal." She laughed, a light musical sound that didn't match her words. They sat together in awkward silence, two women bound by fear and new motherhood. When a nurse passed by carrying two bassinets, Margaret's eyes followed, both babies swaddled in identical blue blankets. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. For a split second, she thought one of the infants looked exactly like hers. That night, as Margaret packed to go home, she saw something on the paperwork the hospital handed her, a faint smudge near the line marked Infant ID. The number 302 had been written over another one, darker, almost scratched out. 304. She froze. "Excuse me," she called after the nurse. "Is this right? It looks—" The nurse snatched the form quickly, smiling too wide. "All correct, Mrs. Lewis. The ink just bled. You're cleared to go." Margaret hesitated, looking down at the baby in her arms. Tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blouse. "He's mine," she whispered to herself, more a promise than a fact. As she walked out of St. Mary's Hospital, the sky was bright again, deceptively peaceful. Eleanor was being wheeled out just ahead of her, her husband waiting beside a black car. Their eyes met once more. Eleanor smiled, almost kindly, then turned away as her car door closed with a muted click. Margaret never saw her again, not then, but she would remember that smile for the rest of her life. Years passed. The stormy night at St. Mary's faded into memory, but for Margaret, the unease never truly disappeared. David grew up strong, curious, full of energy, a beautiful boy with sharp gray eyes and dark hair that glimmered like polished stone. Everyone said he looked different from his parents, but Margaret always laughed it off. "He got that from my grandfather," she'd say, forcing a smile. But when David turned 8, the first undeniable crack appeared. It started innocently at a routine doctor's visit. David had caught the flu, and the clinic requested his blood type. When the nurse returned, she frowned. "Oh, negative," she said, "quite rare." Margaret froze. She and Peter were both type A. Her mind started spinning, replaying every biology lesson she'd ever taught her students. 2 type A parents can't have an O negative child. That night, she pulled out the old hospital bracelet and stared at it under the lamplight. Baby boy number 302. the tag that had haunted her for years. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the faded engraving. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." When she tried to bring it up to Peter, he dismissed her instantly. "Margaret, you're overthinking again. You were exhausted that night. You probably remembered the number wrong." "But the records—" "Drop it," he said firmly, his voice colder than she'd ever heard. "David is ours. End of discussion." And so she dropped it, at least out loud. But inside the question grew like a shadow. Years later, during one of David's school art fairs, Margaret met another parent who introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Grayson. The name hit her like a stone. The same eyes, the same elegant composure. Eleanor looked at David from across the room and froze, just for a heartbeat too long. "You have a lovely boy," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Thank you," Margaret replied, studying her carefully. "Does your son go here too?" Eleanor hesitated. "Yes, Daniel, he's over there, the one with the light hair." Margaret turned and saw him, a tall, pale boy with soft features, and eyes the same blue as hers. She felt her breath catch. For a moment, the world around her blurred. The laughter, the music, the chatter of parents, all of it vanished into a ringing void. 2 children, one dark-haired, one fair. 2 mothers, both watching each other, both afraid to speak what they were thinking. That night, Margaret went home and dug through every drawer, every file she owned. The hospital papers, the vaccination forms, none of them felt right. Something had been tampered with. When she finally opened the old box again, the baby bracelet still gleamed faintly under the lamplight. The number seemed to mock her. 302, she whispered to herself, barely audible. What if he was never meant to be mine? Then she closed the box, locked it again, and buried the truth deep inside her heart, vowing that no one, especially David, would ever know. The night after the confrontation felt endless. The house was silent, but the silence wasn't peace. It was punishment. Margaret sat alone in the living room, staring at the half-melted candles on the cake that no one had eaten. The words still echoed in her head. "You're not my real mother." The sound had carved something inside her, something raw and bleeding. Anna had tried to smooth things over before they left. "Maybe it's better if we all cool down," she'd said, in that voice too polite to be sincere. "David just needs time to process." But Margaret saw the flicker in Anna's eyes. Satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting for this explosion all along. Now the house smelled of smoke and sugar, and Margaret's hands wouldn't stop trembling. She opened the hospital file David had thrown on the table. The papers were photocopies, crisp, modern, but the information printed there froze her heart. Mother's name, unknown, temporary guardian, Margaret Lewis. The date matched the night of the storm. The ward name, the time of birth, all correct. But under notes, someone had scribbled, "Patient transferred, ID pending." Her breath hitched. She flipped through the rest, her eyes darting across the lines like a trapped bird searching for an exit. Transferred to where, to whom? She tried to steady herself, but her pulse raced. The edges of the paper blurred. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Hughes, kind, gray-haired, the type who always noticed too much. "I saw the lights on," she said gently. "Are you all right, dear?" Margaret forced a smile. "Just a bit of a misunderstanding, that's all." Mrs. Hughes sighed, looking at the untouched cake. Family can hurt worse than strangers sometimes. After she left, Margaret turned the lights off, clutching the hospital file to her chest. In the darkness, she whispered, "I thought I buried you." But the truth never stays buried. By morning, gossip had already spread. Anna had posted a vague message on social media, something about secrets always coming out. Neighbors called, pretending to check in, their voices full of curiosity. David didn't answer his phone. Margaret stood at her kitchen sink, staring at her reflection in the window. Behind the glass, her garden looked like a graveyard. Wilted roses, fallen petals, forgotten things. She thought of the bracelet again, of Eleanor, of the nurse with the cold eyes. Finally, she whispered to herself, "If the truth is still out there, I'll find it." She grabbed her coat, the old metal box, and the hospital file, and stepped out into the gray morning, headed for the place where it all began, St. Mary's Hospital. St. Mary's Hospital wasn't what it used to be. The moment Margaret stepped through the glass doors, she barely recognized it. The once white walls had turned a sterile gray. The smell of bleach replaced the faint warmth of baby powder and lilies she used to know. The reception desk was sleek and new, manned by a young woman who couldn't have been alive in 1984. "Good morning," the receptionist said cheerfully. "How can I help you?" Margaret hesitated. "I used to work here," she began, "a long time ago. I'm looking for maternity records from July 1984. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the girl interrupted, polite but firm. "Those records were digitized years ago. Most paper files were destroyed when the hospital changed ownership." Margaret felt her heart sink. "Destroyed?" The receptionist nodded. "Unless you have a court order or family authorization, I'm afraid we can't release any historical medical data." Family authorization. The irony was cruel. Her own son didn't even believe she was his mother. Margaret thanked the girl mechanically and wandered down the hall, ignoring the signs that said, "Staff only." Her cane tapped softly on the tile floor, echoing down the corridor. The maternity wing had been moved to another building, but she remembered every turn, every corner. Her body still carried the map of that place. When she reached the end of the corridor, she saw a small plaque that read "Archives." She knocked. After a long pause, the door opened. An elderly woman peered out, gray hair pinned neatly back, sharp eyes behind thick glasses. For a moment, neither spoke. Then recognition flickered across the woman's face. "Margaret Lewis?" the woman whispered. Margaret's breath caught. "Nancy?" They had worked together decades ago. Nancy, the night nurse who had stayed through the storm. "Oh my God, it is you," Nancy said softly. "I never thought I'd see you again." Margaret stepped closer. "I need to know what really happened that night, Nancy. July 16th, 1984. The blackout." Nancy's eyes darted around nervously. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "People lost their jobs over what happened. Some things were covered up." "Covered up?" Margaret's voice trembled. "You mean—" "There were 2 babies born within minutes of each other," Nancy interrupted quietly. "One went to the wrong mother. We noticed the mistake after the power came back, but someone higher up told us to leave it be. They said it would ruin lives." Margaret's blood ran cold. "You mean mine?" Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "We tried to fix it. We wanted to tell you, but the files disappeared, and the head nurse, she was paid off by someone with money." A chill spread through Margaret's chest. "Eleanor," she whispered. Nancy looked at her sharply. "So you know her name?" Margaret felt her legs weaken, gripping the doorframe for balance. The truth she'd buried for 40 years was clawing its way back up, and this time she couldn't stop it. Nancy led Margaret down a narrow hallway behind the archive room, a place where the hospital stored old furniture, broken filing cabinets, and boxes marked "to be disposed." The air was thick with dust, the scent of rust and forgotten things. "I shouldn't be showing you this," Nancy muttered, glancing over her shoulder. "But if anyone deserves to know, it's you." She stopped at a dented metal cabinet, tugged open the bottom drawer with a groan. Inside were old folders, their corners curled, the ink faded from time. Nancy sifted through them with trembling fingers until she found one labeled Maternity Ward, July 1984, Power Failure Report. Margaret's heart pounded as Nancy handed it to her. The folder was thin, but inside it lay a single page that changed everything. Patient A, Margaret Lewis, delivered 11:58 p.m. Patient B, Eleanor Grayson, delivered 12 o'clock a.m. Note: identification bracelets reissued during outage. Infant tags mixed during manual reapplication. Correction noted post-shift. But there was no signature, just a red stamp that read, "Reviewed, cleared by H.N." "H.N.?" Margaret whispered. "The head nurse," Nancy said. "Helen Norris. She retired years ago, but—" "Margaret, there's more." From the back of the folder, Nancy pulled a Polaroid photo. 2 bassinets, side by side, taken the morning after the storm. The babies were nearly identical in size. One had a faint birthmark on his left ankle. Margaret stared at it, her breath catching. "David had that same mark." Nancy nodded slowly. Then it was never supposed to be a question. Tears blurred Margaret's vision. Her hands shook so badly that the photo slipped from her grasp and floated to the floor. 40 years, Nancy, she whispered. 40 years of lies. Nancy placed a hand on her arm. "You were the only one who loved that boy like a real mother. Paperwork doesn't change that." Before Margaret could answer, her phone buzzed. The sound cut through the heavy silence. She looked down. "David." Her throat went dry. She answered. "David? Where are you?" His voice was low, controlled, but cold. "Anna said you went to the hospital." Margaret hesitated. "I needed answers." "So it's true," he said bitterly. "You knew there was a chance I wasn't yours, and you never told me." "I didn't know for sure," she pleaded. "David, please listen." "I don't want your excuses," he snapped. "You lied to me my entire life. I don't even know who I am anymore." The line went dead. Margaret stood there, her phone still against her ear, the sound of static fading into silence. Nancy's hand squeezed her shoulder gently. "Find the truth, Margaret," she whispered. "But be ready. It won't set you free. It'll break you first." Margaret bent down, picked up the Polaroid, and stared at the tiny ankle in the picture. The faint mark looked just like the one on David's skin, and that was when she knew she could no longer hide. The evening air was heavy when Margaret stepped out of St. Mary's, clutching the folder against her chest like a wounded bird. The streetlights flickered, rain misting down in soft, cold threads. The hospital's reflection shimmered on the wet pavement, the same building where her life had splintered 40 years ago. By the time she reached home, her clothes were damp, her hair clinging to her temples. She moved slowly through the quiet house, her shoes leaving faint prints on the tile. Everything felt smaller, as if her home itself had shrunk beneath the weight of what she'd learned. She set the folder on the dining table, the same table where David had shouted at her days before. The birthday cake still sat there, dried and forgotten, its frosting cracked like old paint. The sight of it made her chest tighten. The front door opened. David stood in the entryway, his face unreadable. He looked tired, haunted. A boy trying to be a man in the ruins of his own identity. "Anna told me you went digging again," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Looking for proof." Margaret didn't turn. "I had to know," she whispered. "Know what?" His voice trembled. Anger and confusion knotted together. "That I'm not your son? That you stole me?" She turned then, eyes red but steady. "I didn't steal you, David. You were given to me, by mistake, and I tried to fix it, I did, but no one would listen. They buried it all." David's jaw clenched. "So you suspected all these years and you still let me live a lie?" Margaret reached for the folder. "You deserved a life built on love, not paperwork. I was afraid the truth would destroy you." He snatched the folder from her hands and opened it, flipping through the yellowed pages. His eyes darted over the words, his breath catching when he saw the Polaroid photo. "What is this?" "That's you," she said softly.
The morning after you were born, you had that tiny birthmark on your ankle. You still do."
David stared at the photo, then back at her. "You can't know that. This doesn't prove anything."
Margaret stepped forward, her voice breaking. "I do know. I was there. I held you first, and I loved you every single day since that night."
He looked at her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and pain. "You're telling me my whole life, everything, was built on a hospital's mistake?"
"Yes," she whispered, "but it was also built on love. That part was never a mistake."
David turned away, running a hand through his hair. "And my real mother? The one who was supposed to have me, what happened to her?" Margaret hesitated, her heart pounding. "Her name was Eleanor Grayson." David froze. The name hung in the air like a curse. He turned back slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Grayson?" Margaret nodded. "You've met her son, haven't you?" David's face went pale.
"Daniel, from school, he looked so much like you,"
Margaret whispered, almost to herself, "because he was mine." The room fell into a silence that screamed louder than any words could. The thunder outside roared as if echoing the chaos inside the house. Rain slammed against the windows, streaking down the glass like tears. David stood by the table, gripping the hospital folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You knew," he said finally, his voice low, dangerous. "All this time you knew I wasn't yours." Margaret shook her head slowly.
"No, I only suspected. I begged them to check, but they said everything was fine. I wanted to believe them, David. I needed to believe them."
He slammed the folder shut, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "You needed to believe it? What about me? Did you ever think I deserved to know who I really am?"
"I was protecting you," she cried, her voice trembling. "You were a baby. You were my whole world. I didn't care about DNA or hospital mistakes. I only cared about you."
David's face twisted in pain. "You made me live a lie. I gave you a life," Margaret snapped, the words bursting out before she could stop them. Her chest rose and fell as years of silence cracked open. "When your father left, when money ran out, when you were sick, I was there. Every scraped knee, every nightmare, every broken heart. I was there." David looked away, his jaw trembling. "You lied every single day." Margaret stepped closer, her voice softening. "No, David, I loved you every single day." For a long time, he said nothing. The storm outside filled the space between them. The smell of wet earth seeped in through the open window. Finally, David spoke, quieter now, almost like a child again. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Margaret's eyes glistened. "Because I was afraid the truth would take you away from me." He sank into a chair, running a shaking hand over his face. "So all this time, that woman, Eleanor Grayson, she knew?" Margaret hesitated. "I don't know how much she knew, but she was there that night. Her baby was weak, mine was strong, and someone decided it was easier to switch them." David's voice broke. "So I was traded? Like a thing?" "No," Margaret cried, dropping to her knees in front of him. "You were loved. You are loved. You were never a mistake to me, David. Never." He stared down at her, torn between fury and grief. His lips parted, but no words came out. The sound that escaped him wasn't anger. It was a sob. Margaret reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered. "You're my son," she said, her voice shaking. "Maybe not by blood, but by every heartbeat I've ever had." For a moment their eyes met, two broken souls caught between truth and love. Then David stood abruptly, the chair scraping backward. "I need to think," he said. "I can't do this right now." He walked out into the rain, leaving the door wide open behind him. The wind howled through the house, scattering papers from the folder across the floor. Margaret didn't chase him. She just sat there, watching the rain soak into the pages of the truth she had fought so long to hide. And for the first time in 40 years, she let herself cry without holding back. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the sky remained heavy and gray, like a bruise that refused to fade. Margaret hadn't slept. The hospital file lay open on the table beside a cold cup of tea. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's face, that mix of pain, betrayal, and something deeper she couldn't name. She knew what she had to do. Pulling on her coat, she slipped the file into her bag and drove to the edge of town, where the old Grayson estate still stood behind iron gates and trimmed hedges. Time hadn't touched it. Or maybe money had simply kept time at bay. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled up to the circular driveway. A caretaker led her inside. "Mrs. Grayson isn't well," he said softly. "She doesn't see many visitors." "I won't take long," Margaret replied. When she entered the parlor, she saw Eleanor sitting by the window, wrapped in a pale shawl. Her once perfect hair had turned silver, her face delicate but sharp, like a porcelain figurine cracked and glued back together. She looked up as Margaret approached, and for a moment something like recognition flickered in her eyes. "Margaret Lewis," she said, her voice a whisper that carried weight. "I wondered when you'd come." Margaret stopped in front of her. "You remember me." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I never forget the people I owe." Margaret's throat tightened. "You mean the people you wronged?" Eleanor's smile faded. "You still think I took something from you?" Margaret pulled the folder from her bag and placed it on the table between them. "I know what you did. I spoke to Nancy. I saw the records. The bracelets were switched that night, and someone paid to make sure it stayed that way." Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the window. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "My son, my real son. He was dying, Margaret. They told me he wouldn't make it through the night. And then, after the blackout, there was hope again. He was breathing, strong. I didn't question it. I couldn't." Margaret's voice trembled. "You knew." Eleanor turned to her, eyes wet but defiant. "I suspected, but when I saw the truth on paper, when I realized the boy I'd raised wasn't mine, it was too late. I couldn't take him away from you. You were poor, yes, but you were kind, and he was happy." Margaret's hands shook. "So you let me raise your son while you raised mine?" "I told myself it was fate," Eleanor said quietly. "That maybe God had corrected a mistake. But then Daniel, your son, grew up, and every time I looked at him I saw you. The guilt ate me alive." Margaret stepped back, overwhelmed. "You played God with 2 children." Eleanor closed her eyes. "No, I was just a mother who couldn't bear to lose her child, just like you." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd both lost. Finally, Margaret whispered, "He deserves to know. They both do." Eleanor nodded slowly, her voice cracking. "Then it's time, Margaret. It's time we tell them the truth." It was late afternoon when Margaret and Eleanor stood side by side on Margaret's porch. 2 women bound by guilt and love, their faces etched with decades of silence. The sky was still gray, the kind of light that makes everything look washed out, like an old photograph. Margaret's hands trembled as she poured tea neither of them would drink. "They're on their way," Margaret said softly. Eleanor nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "Daniel said he'd come, and you're sure David will too?" Margaret hesitated. "He didn't promise, but he deserves to hear it from us." Moments later, a car pulled up. 2 men stepped out, strangers in blood but not in fate. David, tall, guarded, eyes shadowed, and Daniel, fair-haired, calm, the kind of calm that only comes from not knowing yet that your world is about to break. When they entered, the air shifted. David stopped at the doorway, his eyes flicking between the two women. "What is this?" he demanded. Margaret stood, her voice trembling but steady. "It's time you knew everything." Eleanor rose slowly. "David, you were born my son." The words hung heavy, like a blade in the air. David's brow furrowed. "What?" Eleanor took a step forward. "You and Daniel were switched the night you were born. It was my fault. I thought I was saving my child, but I was stealing someone else's." Daniel froze, confusion washing over him. "What are you talking about?" Margaret turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Daniel, you're my son." Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. He looked from one woman to the other, then at David. Two lives colliding in one impossible moment. David laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "So it's true, I'm not hers, I'm yours." Eleanor nodded, tears falling freely now. "Yes, but she raised you. She gave you everything I couldn't." David's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. "You think that makes it better? You bought me." Eleanor flinched. "I didn't buy you. I begged for mercy. I thought I'd lost everything. I didn't know how to let go." Margaret stepped between them. "Enough. This isn't about blame anymore. It's about the truth, and what we do with it now." David looked at her, pain breaking through the anger. "You should have told me years ago." "I know," she whispered, "but I loved you too much to lose you." Daniel, still pale, spoke for the first time. "And me? Who am I supposed to be now?" Margaret turned to him, her voice breaking. "You're my son. Not because of a hospital record, but because I carried you inside me, and I'm sorry for the life you never got." Eleanor placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you both know I'm sorry too." The room fell silent. The storm outside had stopped, but inside, hearts were still colliding. David sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Daniel knelt beside him, placing a hesitant hand on his shoulder. For the first time in 40 years, the truth had found its voice, and it left everyone shattered. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a look, not of hatred, but of shared grief. Two mothers, two sons, one irreversible truth. Days passed, but the house remained unnervingly quiet. The truth had been spoken, yet the air still felt heavy, as if grief itself had decided to stay. David hadn't come back since that afternoon. Daniel visited once, bringing flowers, but left quickly, polite, lost, unsure how to belong. Margaret moved through her home like a ghost, touching the furniture, the framed photos, the small memories that had once meant certainty. Now every picture felt like a question. One evening, as she was washing dishes, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant. "Mrs. Lewis, this is Clara, Eleanor's caretaker. I thought you should know. Mrs. Grayson passed away this morning." Margaret froze. The dish slipped from her hand, shattering in the sink. "What?" "She'd been ill for months," Clara continued gently. "We found something she wanted you to have, a sealed envelope. She said, 'Give it to Margaret Lewis if I'm gone.'" Margaret's knees weakened. "I'll come by," she whispered. When she arrived at the Grayson estate, the house was eerily still. The scent of lilies filled the parlor, the kind reserved for mourning. Clara handed her the envelope, yellowed, edges fragile, Eleanor's handwriting delicate and looping. Margaret drove home without opening it. She set it on the table, staring at it as if it might breathe. Part of her wanted to burn it, to let the past finally rest. But another part, the same part that had driven her back to the hospital, whispered, "You need to know everything." When she finally tore the seal, a faint scent of lavender escaped. Eleanor's perfume. Inside was a letter, written in shaking ink. "Margaret, if you're reading this, then my lies have followed me to the grave. I owe you the truth, not the one I told that day, but the real one I've carried in silence for 40 years. Margaret's breath caught. Her eyes scanned the page. It wasn't the doctors who decided to switch our babies. It was me. I begged the head nurse, Helen Norris, to help me, but I didn't do it just because my child was weak. Margaret's fingers trembled. Peter came to me months before that night. He told me he was leaving you. He said he loved me, that we'd start a new life. But when I got pregnant, he panicked. He told me to forget him, that you must never know. I gave birth that same night as you, and when I saw your son, our son, I couldn't let him go. The words blurred as tears filled Margaret's eyes. She could barely read the last lines. I thought I could live with it, but every time I looked at him, I saw Peter. I saw what I stole from you. I'm sorry, Margaret, more than you'll ever understand. The letter slipped from her trembling hands and fluttered to the floor. For years she'd carried guilt for raising someone else's child, never knowing that the boy she'd loved more than her own life was, in truth, her flesh and blood. Margaret sat motionless on the kitchen floor, the letter spread open beside her, the ink running from her tears. The rain had started again, soft, steady, like a heartbeat against the window. The house felt alive, breathing with memories she had spent her whole life trying to forget. Peter. The name pulsed in her mind like an old wound reopening. Her husband, the man who had walked away from her with a suitcase and a muttered, "I just need space." The man who never came back. For years she told David he had died in an accident. That was easier than telling him the truth, that he had chosen another life. Margaret rose unsteadily, her hands gripping the counter. She looked at the photo on the wall, her wedding day. Peter stood behind her, a handsome man in a gray suit, smiling for the camera. She had loved him with the kind of love that forgives too easily. She remembered the months before David's birth, the late nights, the phone calls that stopped when she entered the room, the faint scent of perfume on his collar, not hers, lavender. Eleanor's perfume. Her breath caught. It had been there all along, the same scent that had clung to the letter, the same one she'd smelled when she stood in Eleanor's parlor just days ago. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, clutching the frame to her chest. "You lied to me," she whispered through clenched teeth. "Both of you." The memories crashed over her. Peter holding her hand during the early contractions, his face pale, eyes darting toward the door. The way he disappeared just before the blackout. The way Eleanor's husband had never been seen at the hospital. She had blamed herself for everything. For the mix-up, for the guilt, for the years of confusion. But now she realized the truth was far crueler. It wasn't an accident. It was a decision. She stumbled to the living room, the letter still in her trembling hand. David's photo sat on the mantel, his graduation day, his proud smile, his arm around her shoulder. Her voice broke into the silence. "You were mine all along." She said it again, louder, as if saying it could make it real. "You were mine." The grief tore through her like a storm. Not the quiet kind, but the kind that rips the roof off a life. The phone rang, sharp and sudden, cutting through her sobs. She wiped her eyes and answered. "Mom?" It was David. His voice was hesitant, uncertain. "Can I come over?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." When she hung up, she pressed the letter to her chest. Eleanor's confession burned in her hands like a live ember. For 40 years, she had carried guilt for stealing another woman's child. Now she knew it was her child who had been stolen from her, and soon she would have to tell him the truth. When David arrived, the rain had slowed to a mist, the kind that lingers long after the storm has passed. Margaret stood at the window, holding the letter close to her chest, her heart pounding like it wanted to escape. She had rehearsed what to say 100 times, but the words still felt impossible. He stepped inside quietly, dripping rain onto the floor. His face was tired, older somehow. The boy she'd raised was gone, replaced by a man carrying too much truth. "I didn't know if you'd still want to see me," he said softly. Margaret turned to him, her voice trembling. "You're my son, David. I will always want to see you." He hesitated, then took a step closer. "You said that even after what I said to you?" She nodded slowly. "You were angry. You had every right to be, but there's something more you need to hear. Something I didn't know until today." He frowned. "Another secret?" She handed him the letter. "It's from Eleanor. She passed away this morning." He took it carefully, glancing down at the faded handwriting. "I don't think I want to read." "Please," she whispered, "you need to." He unfolded it reluctantly and began to read. The silence in the room thickened as his eyes moved across the page. His jaw tightened, his breath grew shallow. When he reached the last line, he froze. "Peter," his voice cracked. "She says Peter was my father." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Yes." He looked up at her, face pale. "You mean the man who raised me, the man you were married to, he was my real father?" "Yes," she said, barely breathing. "You're not just mine in heart, David. You always were, by blood, by birth, by everything." He stepped back, as if the air itself had turned against him. "All this time." He ran a hand through his hair, eyes wide with disbelief. "You thought you were raising someone else's child, and I thought you'd lied about being my mother, but it was true all along." Margaret's voice broke. "I loved you even when I thought you weren't mine, and now that I know you are, it feels like I've been given a second chance at life." David's eyes glistened, torn between relief and heartbreak. "And Eleanor? She knew?" "She knew," Margaret whispered, "and she carried that guilt until it killed her." David pressed the letter against his forehead, tears falling freely now. "I hated you," he said hoarsely. "I said things I can never take back." Margaret shook her head, stepping closer. "You don't have to take them back. You were searching for the truth, just like I was." He looked at her, eyes softening. "So all this time, I belonged here." She reached out, her hand trembling as it touched his cheek. "You always did." For the first time in weeks, David didn't pull away. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes, tears mingling with his. For decades, she had lived under the weight of a lie, and now, in this single embrace, she felt the truth finally heal what the years had broken. But somewhere deep inside she knew truth has a cost, and the rest of it hadn't been paid yet. The next morning, sunlight spilled weakly through the lace curtains, painting the floor in pale gold. For the first time in days, the house didn't feel haunted, just quiet, fragile, waiting. Margaret sat on the sofa, the letter from Eleanor folded neatly in her lap. David had stayed the night, sleeping in his old room like he hadn't done in years. Every creak of the floorboards above her reminded her that this time he had come home, truly home. She heard a car pull up outside. Moments later, a soft knock sounded at the door. When she opened it, her breath caught. Daniel stood there. He looked tired, older than before, as though the truth had aged him overnight. In his hand was a single rose, not for show, but something he'd picked himself, the stem still damp from the morning dew. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Margaret nodded, stepping aside. "Of course." He glanced around the living room, taking in the photographs, the scent of coffee, the warmth that somehow felt like memory. "So this is where I should have grown up." Margaret's chest tightened. "You're welcome here, Daniel, always." David appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression uncertain. When his eyes met Daniel's, both men froze. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, one familiar, one foreign. Daniel broke the silence first. "I read the letter. My mother left me one too." He swallowed. "She told me the truth. About you, about the hospital, about everything." David nodded slowly. "So now you know we were switched." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "She said you were never supposed to be part of her world, but you were, and I wasn't." Margaret stepped forward. "No, none of that matters now." Daniel turned to her, his voice rising just enough to tremble. "It matters to me. I grew up thinking I was loved because I was a Grayson. But I was living your life, Margaret. The love, the family. It was meant for you and your son." Tears welled in her eyes. "It wasn't your fault." "I know," Daniel said softly, "but it still feels like I stole something that wasn't mine." David finally came closer, his tone gentle. "You didn't steal it, Daniel. You were just born into someone else's mistake, just like me." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Daniel held out the rose, placing it in Margaret's hands. "This was in my mother's garden," he said. "She wanted you to have it. She wrote that you were the better mother, even when the world told you otherwise." Margaret's voice broke as she whispered, "She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't evil either. She was just human." David looked at his brother, because that's what he was, no matter how twisted their paths had been. "We both were," he said quietly. Daniel nodded, tears glistening. Margaret looked between the two of them, one she'd raised, one she'd lost, and felt the impossible weight of love for both. She reached out, taking their hands in hers. "You were both stolen," she said softly, "but if I could, I'd choose to love you both all over again." Neither man spoke, but both leaned in, their hands tightening around hers. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying away 40 years of lies. And for the first time, the house felt whole. Weeks passed. The story that had once belonged to a single night in 1984 now lived in the open, rippling through every part of their lives. But the silence that followed was somehow heavier than all the shouting and tears. David had moved into a small apartment in town, saying he needed space to breathe. Daniel went back to settle Eleanor's affairs, but his messages came less often. The brothers, once strangers, now bound by blood, spoke rarely, their connection tender but unsteady, like a bridge still under construction. And Margaret, she stayed behind. Every morning she woke to an empty house, the light falling across 2 coffee cups on the kitchen counter, one for her, one for the son who wasn't there anymore. Sometimes she forgot and poured 2 cups anyway. Habit, she told herself, or maybe hope. The walls seemed to breathe with echoes of the past. David's laughter as a boy, Peter's footsteps pacing late at night, her own whispered prayers when no one was listening. Every sound reminded her of what had been taken, and what she had unknowingly taken in return. One afternoon she walked into David's old room. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The shelves still held his trophies, a stack of comic books, a photo of him at graduation, grinning, his arm around her shoulders. For years, she'd believed that was her proudest day. Now she wasn't sure if it was real or part of the lie they'd both been trapped in. Her hand trembled as she picked up the photo frame. "I loved you right," she whispered, "even when everything else was wrong." The tears came quietly, not the violent sobs of shock, but the slow, weary kind that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the heart, the kind that tasted like acceptance. Later that evening, the mail arrived. Among the bills and catalogs was a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a note in David's handwriting. "Mom, I'm trying to understand everything. I don't know who I am yet, but I know you're part of it. I'll come home soon. D. Margaret pressed the letter to her chest, her lips trembling between a sob and a smile. For the first time in weeks, she opened the window wide. The autumn wind carried in the faint scent of rain and cut grass. She closed her eyes and imagined two little boys, one dark-haired, one fair, running through her garden, laughing, calling her name. The truth had broken her life apart, but in its ruins, something quieter had begun to grow. Not forgiveness yet, but something close. As the evening light softened into gold, Margaret whispered to the wind, "If love was my mistake, then I'd make it again." The room grew dim, and in the fading light, the two coffee cups on the counter glimmered side by side, one half empty, one waiting. The days turned cold. Autumn bled slowly into winter, and the leaves outside Margaret's window fell like burnt pages from an old story. She spent her mornings wrapped in a blanket by the fireplace, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her gaze fixed on the empty chair across the room. That chair had always been David's, the one he used to sink into after work, grumbling about his day, half listening to her stories. Now it sat silent, collecting dust and distance. Some nights she still woke from dreams that blurred past and present. In one, she was back in the hospital, holding two babies in her arms, one crying, one sleeping, and a faceless nurse asking, "Which one do you want to keep?" She'd wake up gasping, her chest aching as though she'd actually been forced to choose. The doctor said it was grief. Margaret knew it was penance. One afternoon, she gathered her courage and drove to the cemetery on the hill, the one overlooking the town where she had built and lost everything. Eleanor's grave was new, the flowers still fresh. Margaret stood in silence for a long time before kneeling beside it. "I read your letter," she whispered. "You were right. The truth did break me." Her breath fogged in the cold air. "But I can't hate you, Eleanor. We were both mothers doing the wrong things for the right reasons. I just wish we'd had the courage to tell the truth sooner." She placed a single rose, the last one Daniel had given her, beside the headstone. For a moment, she thought she saw Eleanor's reflection in the polished marble, smiling through the years that divided them. As she turned to leave, a familiar voice called out behind her. "Mom?" Margaret froze. She turned slowly. David stood a few feet away, hands shoved in his coat pockets, eyes red from the wind. Or something else. "You came?" she breathed. "I told you I would." He gave a small, uncertain smile. "Daniel's here, too. We thought you might be." Behind him, Daniel approached, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. The brothers exchanged a glance, not the awkward, searching kind from before, but something steadier. Shared understanding, shared loss. David spoke softly. "We've been talking about everything, about her, about you." Margaret's throat tightened, and David took a step closer. "And we figured, maybe love isn't about who was supposed to be whose. Maybe it's about who showed up, and you always did." Her tears came silently, her breath catching as David reached for her hand. Daniel placed the flowers on Eleanor's grave, then came to stand beside them. For a long moment, the three of them stood together under the pale winter sun, not as strangers tangled in lies, but as something new, fragile, and real. Margaret looked up at the sky and whispered, "Maybe that's what forgiveness looks like." The wind stirred gently, lifting the rose petals from the grave and scattering them through the air like a soft benediction. As they turned to leave, David slipped his arm through hers. Daniel followed close behind. For the first time in decades, Margaret didn't feel like she was walking alone. The road down the hill shimmered in the late light, winding homeward, not perfect, not painless, but hers again. Winter melted into spring, and with it, The long silence that had hung over Margaret's house began to lift. The garden she'd once neglected bloomed again, wild and uneven, but full of life. Every morning, she would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sunlight spill over the flowers. The air smelled of earth and forgiveness. David had started visiting more often. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with Daniel. They didn't talk about the hospital or Eleanor or that letter. They talked about ordinary things, the weather, the neighbor's new dog, how David was learning to cook without burning everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Margaret treasured the smallness of it, the unspoken understanding that love didn't need to be explained anymore. One Saturday afternoon, the brothers helped her repaint the living room. Daniel held the ladder while David grumbled about the color choice. The sound of their laughter filled the house like sunlight in dusty corners. "Mom," David said suddenly, glancing at her with a boyish grin. "You always said this room needed a new beginning. I guess you were right." She smiled, eyes misty. "We all needed one." When they finished, the three of them stood back to admire their work. The walls, once faded and cracked, now gleamed with a soft shade of cream, warm and open like a blank page. As evening fell, Margaret made dinner. The table, once the scene of accusations and tears, now held bowls of soup and laughter. Daniel told stories about his travels. David teased him like brothers do. Every so often, their laughter would fade into quiet, and their eyes would meet hers, grateful, forgiving, real. Later that night, after they left, Margaret sat alone by the fireplace. The house was peaceful again, not empty this time, just still. She looked at the photo on the mantel, the three of them from earlier that day, paint on their hands, smiles unguarded. For the first time, she didn't see a broken family. She saw healing. Her gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the moonlight brushed over the rose bushes. The same kind of roses Daniel had brought from Eleanor's garden, a piece of the past reborn into her present. She whispered softly, "We did it, Eleanor, they're all right." The fire crackled, its warmth wrapping around her like an embrace. She closed her eyes and let the quiet fill her chest. Not the suffocating kind, but the kind that comes after the storm has passed and the world feels new again. In that moment, she finally understood something she had never dared to believe before. Forgiveness doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. The clock chimed midnight. Margaret smiled faintly. The house, once full of ghosts, now only held memories, softer, kinder, finally at peace. And as she drifted into sleep in her favorite chair, a soft breeze slipped through the open window, carrying with it the scent of lavender and roses. It was as if Eleanor herself had stopped by to say goodbye. The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains, painting soft golden stripes across the kitchen floor. Margaret hummed under her breath as she set out 3 cups on the table, not out of habit, but with quiet intention. One for herself, one for David, one for Daniel. She smiled at how natural it felt again, to expect laughter, to make space. The kettle whistled just as she heard footsteps outside. The door opened without knocking, David's voice calling, "Mom, you up?" "I've been up since dawn," she replied, pretending to sound annoyed though her heart swelled at the sound of him. He stepped inside, followed by Daniel, carrying a basket of fresh flowers. "From Eleanor's garden," Daniel said softly. "They've started blooming again." Margaret took the basket in both hands, breathing in the scent, lavender and roses, the same fragrance that had once carried pain, now reborn as something gentler. "They're beautiful," she whispered. David leaned against the counter. "We were talking last night," he said carefully, "about everything that's happened. Margaret looked up, uncertain. And? Daniel smiled faintly. We decided to start something new, together, a charity in both your names, the Grace and Lewis Foundation, for children separated at birth, adoption cases, lost family reunions. We want to help people find their way home. For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. Her hands covered her mouth, and her eyes filled with tears. You boys, you're turning all this pain into something good. David stepped closer, his voice low but steady. You taught us that love doesn't end when the truth hurts. It just changes shape. Margaret reached out and pulled them both into her arms, her voice breaking. I thought I'd lost everything, but it turns out I had everything I needed all along. They stood there for a long time, 3 lives rebuilt from the wreckage of one long secret night. After breakfast, they went outside to the garden. The morning air was cool, the sky streaked with soft blue. The rose bushes swayed gently in the wind. Daniel kneeled and planted a small wooden sign in the soil. It read, For Eleanor and Peter, 2 souls who made mistakes, and 1 woman who turned them into love. Margaret's hand brushed the engraving, her heart swelling with a bittersweet peace. They'd like that, she said softly. David looked at her. Mom, do you ever wish things had been different? She thought for a moment. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of spring. Sometimes, she admitted, but if they had been, I might never have met the version of you that I love most, the one who came back. David smiled, tears glimmering in his eyes. Then I guess I'm home. The 3 of them stood together, watching the sunlight spill across the garden, a place once haunted by secrets, now reborn in forgiveness. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret felt light. The past would always be there, but so would the love that had survived it. She looked up at the sky and whispered, Thank you for giving me my sons. The breeze answered softly, carrying the scent of roses through the air. As the camera fades, the garden glows under the morning light, a symbol of renewal, of a family broken and mended in ways that only love could explain. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Let us know what you felt. Comment 1 if you believe a mother's love can survive any truth. Comment 0 if you think some secrets should have stayed buried. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will break your heart, heal it, and stay with you long after the screen fades to black.